본 회의는
Ladies and gentlemen, simultaneous interpretation will be provided throughout the conference. If you are on site and if you need a translation service, channel 1 is Korean, channel 2 is English. If you are virtually joining us, please make sure to choose the channel that you prefer to listen at the bottom of the screen. Ladies and gentlemen, we'll now commence the 2021 May 26 hosted by the Institute for Far Eastern Studies and also sponsored by the Ministry of Unification. The University International Conference on Urban Study 2021 will begin under the title of the Urban Kaleidoscope of North Korea. Good afternoon. I am Moon-il, professor of Kyungnam University. Today we'll be talking about the sessions. We have invited moderator and speakers and panelists. We are going to have 3 sessions right here at the Institute for Far Eastern Studies at the Hall of Cheongsan. We are joined by participants, professors of the Institute for Far Eastern Studies, Kyungnam University, and invited professors, and also Professor Kyung-Tae and Professor Hyun-soo and Professor Chang-mo and Professor Choi Dae-Sik, head of the center, and Professor Chung Hyun-chul, and Professor Annie Padret of the College of Fine Arts, and Professor Chung In-ha, Professor Im Dong-ho. Thank you very much. And at the same time, virtually, we are joined by Professor Robert Winsterry-Chester, and also from Germany, we have Philip Meuser and also Dr. Jelena Proskopievich and also Professor Annie Padret. Jelena. Thank you so much for joining us. And virtually, globally, we are joined by participants. Thank you from the bottom of my heart. And also I extend my heartfelt welcome. We'll be talking about Pyongyang and city planning, river and North Korean city, and city-state Pyongyang from past to future. Those are the topics of the 3 sessions. I sincerely hope that you can share your wisdoms, knowledge, and experience during the conference. So we will kick off the first session, but before that, since we are hosting such a meaningful conference, we'd like to hear the opening remarks by the person who always gives a lot of encouragement, the head of the Institute for Far Eastern Studies.
안녕하십니까?
Good afternoon, good morning. I'm the head of IFES, Kwan-Sei. Today, we're hosting the International Academic Conference on Urban Kaleidoscope of North Korea, and it is a great pleasure, and I think it is very meaningful. We are hosting this seminar with experts from home and abroad. As you all know, this January, it had its 8th Workers' Party meeting, Congress, this January, and it has newly announced a new construction project of 50,000 households, and as the first phase, it had set a target of constructing 10,000 houses. In the North Korean society, when you think of the meaning and significance of a city, there is a very special and unique sense. The outer exterior is mainly very glorious and spectacular, and it is in unison with the alliance and the united power of the worker. And this is expressed through the architecture. And recently, Pyongyang is focusing its efforts on building new households. This is considering the 20% of urbanization rate of Pyongyang. It is aimed at expanding and facilitating and speeding up the process of urbanization. Today, as we host this seminar, I believe we have an experience to gain greater access, to have better knowledge and insights into the urban process of North Korea. I'd like to thank all the speakers discussants, experts for sparing your precious time to be here with us. And also my special thanks to all the participants who are joining us both online and offline. Thank you very much.
감사합니다.
Thank you. From now, we will officially begin the first session under the title of the Pyongyang and City Planning. The first session will be moderated by Professor Kyung-Tae of National Institute for Unification Education. Moderator Kyung-Tae, would you like to start? Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm very pleased to meet you all. I am the moderator of the first session. My name is Kyung-Tae of the National Institute for Unification Education. We'll be addressing extremely important topic at the same time that is attracting a lot of attention. I'm very grateful for hosting today's meeting, and my gratitude goes to Institute for Far Eastern Studies. The urban kaleidoscope of North Korea is very interesting topic, and during the first session, we'll be talking about Pyongyang and city planning, history, especially the architecture history, and also the changes, especially focusing on the future prospect. We'll be talking about that. That's likely to happen in Pyongyang. We have two presenters and also two discussants, and without any repute, these two speakers and two panelists are truly expert in this field, and we will deeply dive into this topic, and I'm very pleased to work as a moderator, and I'm sure that I'll be learning a lot from them. The presenter and also the discussant, I'll be introducing them one by one when they are about to either give presentation or make a discussion. Recently, there were a lot of changes taking place around and in of Korean Peninsula. U.S. ROK just had a summit meeting. The status of Korea has been upgraded one step further, and we are at the crossroads trying to take a further leap into the future. Until now, talking about North Korean nuclear issues or Korean Peninsula issues, we're very much narrow-minded and focusing on these issues, but we are widening our perspective, going beyond the Korean Peninsula far and focusing on the Northeast Asian issues and the global issues. Now's the time to expand our collaborations between Korea and the United States. And by doing that, the role and responsibility of Korea has been much double or triple, has become much greater. And as we are faced with the transitional period, wisely, we need to seek ways to overcome any possibility of facing conflict and confrontation. We need to establish eternal peace on the Korean Peninsula while expand the cooperations. Now's the time to utilize the opportunity and make it as a momentum. The topic of the first session is Pyongyang and city planning, which is quite timely because instead of looking far beyond the future, this is something that is likely to happen in the near future, especially when Seoul and Pyongyang collaborate. It can provide a stepping stone for all of us. In light of that, this is a very meaningful topic. So once again, we are not talking about what happened in the past, but rather what is about to happen right in front of our eyes that is connected to our future. In that sense, today's conference is very meaningful. That is my expectation. Today, the order of the first session is two speakers will make a presentation in a precise manner, and I'll be giving 20 minutes to each speaker, so please make sure to keep the time. And the discussant, I'll be giving 10 minutes to each discussant. And the remaining time will be allocated for the discussion between the presenter and discussant. And I also would like to open the floor to receive questions from the audience as well. So that's the directions that I'm going to take during the first session. Frankly speaking, these two presenters, well, they are really great speakers, and I wish we had a full day listening to their lecture, but unfortunately we have a limited time. So instead of giving a full-scale explanation, just make sure to deliver your message in 20 minutes. So here comes the first speaker.
I'd like to introduce the first speaker from Kyonggi University School of Architecture. We have Professor Chang-mo. I'd like to ask Professor An to deliver your presentation on history and architecture of Pyongyang.
네, 안녕하십니까.
Hello, just to introduce, I'm Chang-mo. I guess the screen is ready now. The topic of my presentation is the history and architecture of Pyongyang, which I have been requested. So I'd like to be more specific on how the historical city of Pyongyang was transformed into a socialist city. And that will be the focus of my presentation. This has been cited at the Seoul Journal last year, and this is a revised version of this previous publication at the Process of Socialism Urbanization in Pyongyang, published in the Seoul Studies of Research. On the left side, this was a map produced in 1946. Though it's a 1946 map, it showcases the historical remnants of Pyongyang as a historical city. And then the middle is the restoration plan after the Korean War. On the right-hand side, this is the Pyongyang of the current state. And on the second slide, this is the overall Pyongyang's nearby map from Google. And on the bottom side, this is the urban center of Pyongyang. Well, I don't think this is being shown on the screen. I apologize. Overall, Pyongyang is based on a flat land. Pyong of Pyongyang is a Korean Chinese character, which means flat. So this is very contrasting to the Seoul's geography. And could you shift this screen to this side, please? And on this slide, as you can see, this is the old Pyongyang Song Palace, and on the eastern side there's Dae-Dong River, and on the western northern part, this is the Botonggang River. When you look at the overall structure of historical city Pyongyang, on the left-hand side, there's Giseongjeon-do. That is the ancient map during the Joseon Dynasty, and in the middle, this is the Pyongyang during the Japanese occupation. The East Pyongyang on the Dae-Dong River is not urbanized yet. On the right-hand side, the Pyongyang Song Palace is composed of 4 fortresses or palaces. On the top, there is the Northern Palace, and then beneath, there is the inner, the middle, and the outer palace. And on the outer skirts, and this is connected with a fortress to Kumsusan Mountain, and the rest is connected with the river. So it is positioned at a very unique geographical location. Pyongyang, a historical city for a long period, well, actually it was the capital of Goguryeo. Goguryeu's first capital was Gungnaesong Palace in Amrokgang River, and during the 5th century, the capital of Goguryeo was moved to Pyongyang. After that, there wasn't significant change, but in 1902, during the Korean Empire period, in addition to the second palace, the original palace in Seoul, the second palace was built in Pyongyang. And there was the secondary palace of Korean Empire, which was Punggyeonggung Palace. And on the left-hand side, the middle part is Punggyeonggung, and on the right-hand side, this is a bird's view of Punggyeonggung Palace. And this is the construction process. And during the Japanese occupation, this was used as a hospital. And currently, it is located. It is where the Pyongyang Medical School is located, of the Kim Il-sung University. The fundamental changes in Pyongyang was caused with the construction of the Kyonggi Railway. The Kyonggi Railway, well, for those who missed it in the previous slides, let me repeat. The entire city is composed of the northern palace and the middle and inner palace. And the difference here, well, the outer palace is located on a flat land. So when you construct a railway, since it cannot be constructed on curvy and bumpy mountains, the middle palace and the inner palace and its in-between route was where the Kyonggi Railway was constructed. And with the development of Pyongyang city, the front and the rear roads were connected with the Kyonggi Railway station, and centered around the station, the overall urban structure and its pedestrian road and streets were recomposed. During the Japanese colonial rule, Pyongyang was not developed that actively. After liberation, there has been much changes, and I'd like to give you the details on that. At the late 1930s, after the Sino-Japanese War, Japanese now perceive the Pyongyang with a new value. Unlike Seoul, when you think of Pyongyang, there was a coal mine nearby, and there was a more developed industrial site. So it had a bigger role to play as an industrialized city. With the Sino-Japanese War, Japan started to go more inward into the Chinese continent, and it served as an industrial and war central site. And also, industrialization of Pyongyang became facilitated. So around the Potonggang River, a new industrial complex was planned under the Japanese rule. With the World War II and the defeat of Japan, this plan did not materialize. When you look at the right-hand side slide, this is the 1940s map. And when you can see the Potonggang River, and when you look at the mouth part, before meeting with Taedonggang River, you can see that it is in a very curved road, like a snake-like flow, and it caused a lot of flooding. And this was another major project that was required. This is a Dangsangri region. This is a current view. One critical factor for this transformation was this project. At the time of liberation, the then Kim Il-sung government was determined to focus on this region where there was a lot of Koreans residents. But the Japanese government general did not improve the living qualities of Korean people around the riverside. So the then leader Kim Il-sung put it the first priority to improve the living qualities nearby the river. So that was how the Potonggang River transformation and repair project was initiated. And with the achievements of the repair project is resulted in the left-hand side picture. And due to this repair project, the Potonggang River and the Taedonggang River, so accessibility was improved and created a new riverside. And this is what North Korea is boastful of. It is one of its most major public projects. And it has also been one of the most top priority construction projects of the Kim Il-sung government after liberation. Until the Korean War, Soviet Union provided a lot of support for various public construction projects. The Kim Il-sung University and the general hospitals were some examples. And when you look at the major facilities, one unique feature is that they were not centered around in the urban center, but it were decentralized in other parts of the city. This was not a full-fledged socialism, but yet there was a very strong determination not to have an urban center in North Korea back then. And back then, when you look at the architectural structure, since it received the Soviet support, design, and financing, it also adopted the most common style in architecture, which is the neoclassical style. This is the Kim Il-sung General Hospital's construction site. And I believe the guide is giving the briefings of the design map. After liberation, these are the major public areas, and Pyongyang started to work on removing and abolishing the remnants of colonial rule. This is a Moranbong Theater. Previously, there used to be the Pyongyang Shrine, and it was demolished, and the Moranbong Theater was reconstructed. It has a very good view, and it serves as a very symbolic location because it used to be a place to worship the Japanese gods at the Pyongyang shrine, but it was replaced by this cultural facility. This is just before the Korean War. This is the Pyongyang Palace. And when you look at this circular and diagonal type of words, this is the Eastern Pyongyang. And with Korean War, Pyongyang was almost entirely destructed. And after the destruction, a new post-war recovery project was initiated. So, 1953, there has been a cabinet decision number 125 to recover Pyongyang, and it set a very major direction for recovery. Pyongyang has long been a historical city, so its main precondition was its main historical meanings be maintained. And on the right-hand side, instead of focusing on residential development, it put more emphasis on a balanced and well-organized development of the entire city, instead of having a center. And the basic urban development structure has much to do about socialism. In order to treat and recover the destructions of war, it has followed the basic original socialist principles. For example, the Lenin or Stalin's major Soviet constructs is the Narenkopen building or other type of urban construction projects. But since I do not have enough time, I believe I have to jump through these slides. But what we have to remember is, though this is an international conference, when you think of socialist cities or architecture, Koreans and foreigners have a very big difference in their perception. I think this is something we have to note very importantly, because when you think of Koreans' perspective, we received education during the Cold War regime. So there is the sentimental implication of calling the so-called red ideologists, calling socialists. So this also puts a certain boundary and limits on the Koreans of appreciating the socialist architecture, which by contrast for foreigners have a more open appreciation for the socialist architecture. The basic fundamental thinking of socialists are based on science and reason, and this was reflected in their basic architecture, and that was also the same for North Korean socialists. So when you think of the historical architecture, the basic and its basic matters have been the main topic of the scientists when they study the atoms and other elements of matter. And the reconstruction of these matters and elements has been the basis of a socialist approach. So through that, it created a new type of architectural method, which would be the constructionism of Russia. And in this method, during the 1930s in Soviet Union, it had a big impact globally. Nevertheless, with the rule of Stalin, this type of architectural style was disposed of, and the neoclassical architecture became in fashion once again. And with the socialist state, this became the new influence. So when you think of the architectural style, this was a major influence. But when you look at the underlying implication, there was an attempt to control the growth and development of the city, because an expansion of the city was the 18th and 19th century capitalist approach. And so the new approach was to control the size of cities and create a number of balanced small cities. This is based on the socialist approach. The industrialization and the urbanization and its rapid growth was previously regarded as the source of evil, according to the socialists. And this major principle towards the city 1960s were faithfully followed by the architects of Pyongyang as well. And this has been the main principle, and architects like Kim Jong-hee and other scholars that studied in Eastern Europe came to North Korea to be in charge of the North Korea Pyongyang Recovery Project. This is the location of Pyeongyangsang Palace at the heart or center of the city. This is the result of the recovery project. The diagonal or a grid structure is maintained because the geography was not changed, but the Dae-Dong-gang river flow was set as a main axis, and the white line is the pathway of the mountain from Nungsusan Mountain. And so you can see there's a central mountain spine, and this is surrounded by the rivers. And when you compare the sides, when you look at the centers, it is a grid type that is continuously maintained even after the recovery. And when you look at the close-up view, in the center, there's a Kim Il-sung Square, and on the right-hand side, there is an overall bird's view image. And excluding the People's Grand Library, but all the other public facilities were formed during the 1960s. Though we cannot know the exact timing, but when you look at the right side image, when you look at the Kim Il-sung University and its view image on the riverside, there's a green. You can see that the green space doesn't exist anymore. The overall structures and architectures remain the same, but we can see a slight transformation in the usage of the square. This is the Dae-Dong-gang riverside view during the 1960s in Pyongyang. When you think of Seoul, Seoul is sometimes called as a republic of apartments, but you can see that the Pyongyang apartments have a totally different structure. In the middle part, there's a perimeter block, and that is surrounded by the apartments or residential complexes in Pyongyang. Well, originally, it came from European countries, or mainly from the Eastern European countries. Not only the architectural style, but the urban block configuration was also applying the Eastern European style as well. This is a process of construction. This is from late 1950s and early 1960s after the Korean War. And there are I think these are contrasting images. When you think of the economic level or technological limitations, the human workforce played a very big part. But when you look at the bottom picture, you can see these big construction cranes that are now leading the industrial type of construction. This type of industrial architecture played a big role in facilitating the construction of residence after World War II, which was common worldwide, especially in South Korea. Such industrialized architecture was not in full-fledged. So this seemed to be very unfamiliar, whereas it was something very common in North Korea. From late 1950s, early 1960s, the main image were with these neoclassical buildings. This is from the Pyongyang station into the urban area, urban center. And there is a significance, actually a very big significance of this image. You can see as if it reminds us of a green ecological city. This is a bird's eye view of the entire city of Pyongyang. When you think of socialism, it has its own pursuit of ideal urban environment after industrialization. So this is a kind of an echo type of city. When you compare 60 years ago and the present image of Kim Il-sung Square, we see not much has changed. Well, not excluding the People's Grand Library that's added, you can see there isn't much change. And after 1960s, there is a major change in the North Korean architecture, which is the emergence of a nationalist or ethnic-centered architecture. In the past, in Russia, the Russian type of style was then discarded to accept the neoclassical style, and the same was true in North Korea. Instead of neoclassical style, a new nationalist type of architecture was adopted. On the left-hand side, this is the Pyongyang Grand Theater, and on the right-hand side, this is after the design. This is a site visit of Kim Il-sung, field visit. Well, since I do not have enough time, I may not go over the details. But following the order of Kim Il-sung, there were some revisions in the overall map. I don't think I have time to go into the details. And this type of ethnic architecture were most fully or mainly reflected in the cultural facilities such as the Pyongyang Theater or the People's Cultural Palace. And these architectural styles started to become more popular in 1960s, and with the People's Grand Library's construction, it reached its peak. And in the following public facilities, it became less used, but rather more frequently used in commercial facilities such as stores and restaurants. So when you look at this overall ethnic architectural style under the socialist regime, just as I previously mentioned, when you can compare this with the replacement of Stalin's replacement of modernism and constructionism and going toward the European neoclassicism. And in the same context, the previous Soviet-supported neoclassicism architectural styles were then replaced by a new ethnic architectural style, because the neoclassical European style was something so unfamiliar and uncomfortable to the people of its country. And this is the same implication. So neoclassicism of Stalin and the ethnic architectural style of Kim Il-sung may look different, but when you look at its process of social ideology, it followed the same type of it follows the same interpretation. But during the 1960s, there was some changes in such ethnic construction methods. This was mentioned by Professor Kim Hyun-sook's paper. It's going beyond the traditional architectural style to accept more of the modern trends. Instead of just having 100% imitation, it is reflecting more of a modern trend also in Mansudae. And since 1980s, we see that the North Korean architectures follow more of an international trend, and it is transformed into the most high-tech type of modern buildings. And the top example is the World Youth Festival's construction. It was actually in a competitive effort to the 1988 Seoul Olympics. So I covered the modernization process of Pyongyang, and one thing we should not forget is in 1980s, with the 70th birthday of Kim Il-sung, the People's Grand Library and the Juche Tower were constructed. Before, Pyongyang's natural access was the Dae-Dong River. And there were some partial grids along the Dae-Dong River, but with the construction of the People's Grand Library and the Juche Tower in the east and the west, it created a new landscape access in Pyongyang. And afterwards, the landscape axis starts from the Kim Il-sung Square toward the Juche Tower. And so that took place during the 1980s. So when you look at the urban development of Pyongyang of each period, during the 1950s, after the war, there was a recovery to apply the European urban structure of the parameter block, and during the 1960s development, the ethnic style was adopted. And in the 1970s, what was interesting was that I think there was a peak of inter-Korean competition, and urban redevelopment projects took place in both North Korea and Pyongyang and Seoul as well. And in 1980s, both South and North Korea hosted Seoul Olympics and the World Youth Festival in the north. And back then, the creation of an international cities and revolutionary cities and garden cities was a main priority in Pyongyang. In 2010, leader Kim Jong-un announced the construction of 100,000 households in Pyongyang. So this was at the Yeomyung Street and the Future Scientist Street and the Manste Apartment Street. So during the current Kim Jong-un leadership, the 5-year construction plan of 50,000 households is in progress. The 1970s reconstruction process has been the application of the European style to Pyongyang. And that is the overall atmosphere. You see the low-story buildings, the East European type of architecture or landscape. And with the recovery project of Pyongyang, we see the high-rise buildings, which are in a combination. This is the Gwangbok Street's scenery during the World Youth Festival. And after that, for about 20 years, as North Korea went through the arduous march, a new type of construction was virtually suspended. Basically, as with other socialist cities, unlike capitalist cities, these co-owned residential apartments take up the majority of the city site. And this is still true during the Kim Jong leadership. This is the Changjeong Street and the residential apartments near Mansudae. And you can see that they are quite modern, like other cities in other countries. You don't see much difference in Pyongyang. This is a night view. And this is the Future Scientist Street. This is at the southern part of Pyongyang. This is the Yeomyung Street, the well-known street. And recently, Kim Jong-un has led a more ambitious project to provide 50,000 new houses in 5 years. This is focused on the Sadong Street. This is on the eastern side of Pyongyang, which was relatively less developed. So, in the entire region of Pyongyang, it is aimed at balancing the overall development of the city. And this proposal and the financing for the 50,000 household construction may come from the budget that is left from the Wonsan development, because it seems that the Wonsan special zone construction is unlikely to be completed. If there are openings and other issues, Pyongyang is realizing there will be many challenges and limitations to pursue such reforms. So it seems that they shifted the gear towards redeveloping Pyongyang with the same budget. And after the Kim Jong-un took leadership, many urban development projects are said to be implemented. But as a matter of fact, it's not until the Yeomyung Street project, but the Sadong Street project is the most typical type of project example that reflects the style of Kim Jong-un's leadership. And with that, I'd like to conclude my presentation.
네, 안창묘 교수님.
Thank you very much, Professor An. It was a very massive material. And it was a very informative session, an opportunity for us to gain insight. Particularly when you think of the city Pyongyang, we all know it's a very unique city. It almost became nothing during the Korean War. It virtually turned into a blank paper. Of course, it did exist historically, but it was actually a blank space to apply or realize construction of an ideal socialist city. In European countries, when it pursued the construction of socialist cities, there was a conflict with the existing architecture and surroundings. But in North Korea, there was virtually nothing after the Korean War, which was both an advantage and a disadvantage. Through such urban planning, just as Professor An has given us a very detailed explanation, it could also implement a lot of greenery development and the main axis of scenery, and the small focused focused proximity residential area projects were some examples of the uniqueness of the Pyongyang projects. You went through the overall historical overview, including the Pyongyang Station and Kyonggi Station, as it went through the inner palace and the middle palace, which was how Pyongyang was developed. And you also explained how the railway was set that goes through Pyongyang. And so in Pyongyang, the railway split the Pyongyang into two domains. And I think it would also be meaningful to project the future of Pyongyang. So with the Gyeonggi-san railway in Pyongyang, it is quite similar in Seoul. Most of the railway, though, in Korea is made underground, and the top ground level is transformed into more greenery, such as a Yeonnam-dong green space. So we could have that kind of projection. Or we could think of the high-speed railways of China, where new train stations are installed in the outer skirts. So if we imagine the same situation in Pyongyang, we could think of the other economic special zones in Pyongyang, where we could also expect some rapid urban development in the nearby locations. And these are very interesting to imagine, but will they remain as imagination only? We don't have any collaborative body for the inter-Korean construction and architecture, but I think there is a possibility to share such intellectual insights between the two. And one example could be this type of international conference. As a matter of fact, even if we do not engage directly in a dialogue, these type of diverse proposals could also be something that could be meaningful to North Korea. Well, this could be my personal view. But if we think of a couple of experiences, I did realize that North Korea does seem to be monitoring and following us very closely, and is trying to reflect them in their policies. Based on my academic activities, I also proposed of the renovation of the promenades along the Botonggang River, which is not that developed under the not developed as a Taedonggang River. Well, it could be a coincidence, but after 2 years after I made that proposal, North Korea had released in news that it is working on a renovation project of the Botonggang Riverside, and I was very happy to see that. Well, we went through the urban structure of Pyongyang and projecting the future of Pyongyang. It would be better if we meet in person, but at least hosting this type of conference is meaningful, so that because we could provide a communication channel, though indirect, for greater cooperation. And the last part about the Kwon-Sang-Galma tourist zone and its incompletion, and your assumption that its budget is now shifted toward the Pyongyang Center. Well, for that opinion, I like to say that maybe Pyongyang is changing its overall macro level development direction, because during the seventh Congress, there was the military first priority, but with the 8th Congress, the priority and focus was the people, not the military. So we can see that most of its resources is now being emphasized and injected to the people and its welfare. For example, utilizing the military factories for producing the daily necessities of the people, and or changing the airport site into plantations. So from this macro level, when we consider the massive projects such as 50,000 household construction project, well, we don't know whether it will be successful or not under the economic difficulties. But I think we should consider the overall shift in its policy direction. And thank you very much, Professor An, for your very meaningful and interesting presentation. And next,
계획과 변화 전망에
Next, we'll be talking about urban planning of Pyongyang and the future of Pyongyang metropolis. Let me invite Professor Kim Hyun-soo of Dae-Sik University. He's been doing a lot of research for many years, and I believe that we'll be able to hear and learn a lot from Professor Kim Hyun-soo. As I mentioned before, please make sure to complete your presentation in 20 minutes. And if it's insufficient, then during the panel discussion time, definitely we can address more. So Professor Kim Hyun-soo, would you like to start? Thank you. I am Kim Hyun-soo of Dae-Sik University. Once, inter-Korean relationship was really amicable and we had a lot of work to do, but nowadays it's been cooled down a little bit, so not much work to do. But I'm very pleased to be here today, and Professor Kyung-Tae and also Professor Chang-mo and also Discussant, Dr. Kwon Young-Duk from Seoul Institute, and also Director Choi Dae-Sik from Land and Housing Institute. All of these people are a true sense of the expert in the North Korean studies, and I'm very pleased to meet all of you today. Urban planning, especially the future of Pyongyang. That is my presentation title. Professor Chang-mo has mentioned many things, so I will skip the overlapping area. And one thing I'd like to focus on is planning is quite socialism-based idea. So when I say the theories of socialist urban planning, that's grandiose. This is like controlling the whole world with the plan, especially the city of Pyongyang is widely known as a well-planned city. I've never been to Pyongyang, and there's no way for me to forecast the future of Pyongyang. However, I do have experience of working closely for the urban planning of Seoul metropolitan city. For many decades, trial and errors, we have experience, and here we are. Then, what will happen in the future? Beijing, Shanghai, or Ho Chi Minh, all of these cities achieve development based on openness and reform. And based on these cities' experience, we can once again predict the future. Well, the three goals of the socialist city planning is, first of all, bridging the gap between the have and have not urban and rural area. But the most important thing is the city of Seoul was actually, the center was located in Jongno area. But out of 25 districts, the population residing in Jongno is the least population, which means that people no longer actually reside in Junggu area. And if you go to outskirts, there are more population. And if you go to Paju or Dongtan city, there are metropolitan area where people commute. This is the capital cities. But in case of Pyongyang, it's very different. It's not metropolitan city yet. It's very compact, center-oriented city. The greatest change is city like Seoul is a capitalist city, which means that it's expanding city. There's a principle that people are expanding, but socialist ideal city is more linear city, which means that the residential area, the factories, the workplace are in a linear way. That based on that, there's an equal distribution of public goods called accessibility. If you look at this map, there are cities that are built based on the linear city concept. Well, since Professor An mentioned, I will skip this. This is what it looked like 50 years ago. So they have come up with the plans. We have blueprint master plan. As was mentioned before, at the center of Pyongyang, we have the center, and then we have East Pyongyang. And in the East Pyongyang, between the west side and the river, there is a center of historic. And I'm sure that Professor An has talked about this, so I will skip this. And this is the Great People Study House, and this is immense Baroque style building. And now, here, as Professor An talked about Arc de Triomphe, the son has donated this Arc de Triomphe to the father. The below photo shows the Arc de Triomphe of Paris. And in case of Pyongyang, Triumphal Arc is much more modern one. Of course, if you look at the movie of Les Miserables, in order to launch the bomb, it was made in an easier way, but you can see that 13 lanes are intersecting, but Pyongyang doesn't have space like that. But they try to build in a more grandiose way and trying to show something. That's why they built the Triumphal Arc of Pyongyang. Since it was already mentioned by Professor An, I'll skip. What I'm very much interested in is that if you look at here, the efficiency of the basic place here, once again, it looks quite good, but still, if you look at the designs of this whole residential area, it's very straightforward because the infrastructure and also is more efficient to manage this area. But the usage of the land, when it's opened and reformed, it might experience some difficulties. Now going to the residential development. Well, the ideal is great because this is a micro-district idea, and frankly speaking, if you go here, there are community restaurants and shops and also childcare, daycare center. All of these are done within the framework of the socialism. So these are well developed. This is quite outdated about 4 decades ago. But if you look at this layout design, you can see the socialist common lifestyle, and everything comes from the concept of the communism. So they don't have a place so-called living room, but rather everything's are like a space sharing. So it's like a socialist common style, all rooms and community center socialist lifestyle, which means that public facilities, nursery schools, everything's located here. More recently, they have built the future scientist complex called Eunjeong Complex. These are built in a mega style, and they really pay well and also give a special treatment to the scientists. And I think this was a special day. This was the day when, during that week, they've launched the missiles. But what they did was, they have announced they had a groundbreaking ceremony for the constructions of the 10,000 households in Pyongyang. And as the moderator mentioned, also they focus very much on the people's livelihood. So that is why they have announced that they will be building 10,000 households. And Dr. Chung has taken this photo. I mentioned in my introductory remark that they don't have any land market. However, if you look at here, the housings are actually transacted. And we've done a survey among the North Korean refugees, and we have numbered, and this number stands for the area where the land prices are the most expensive, with a great infrastructure and also the accessibilities. Based on that, these number 1 is the most expensive housing ground, and also if you go to number 10 is the least expensive one. So if you go to the outskirts, it's cheaper in terms of the land. Now, regarding the changes that have been taking place in Pyongyang, you can see that there were a lot of changes like the China and Vietnam. They have maintained their constitutions based on the socialism, but also just like Russia and Germany, just like the independent countries, they have also undergone a rapid socialist development. So if you look at North Korea, they have the socialist constitutions and their land price systems, the mechanism itself are very much like a socialist basis. But in the past, if you look at the unified Germany, we can apply the similar principles. But instead of that, we need to focus how the inter-Korean exchanges can actually change that. There is a gap of 30 times of the income between South and North Korea, but we need to reduce to 4 times, and that should be our roadmap for the new economic development for the Korean Peninsula. Especially, we are very much metropolitan area centered, and more than 50% of the Korean Peninsula population reside in the Seoul metropolitan area. And about 15 days ago, Semiconductor Valley means about 520 trillion will be invested in that area. In Songdo area, the bio product, including vaccines, are to be manufactured. So around metropolitan city, mega city will be built. Of course, if you look at the example you can see in Beijing or in Tokyo, everything are led by the government, and all of these are connected. So these are the trends that are happening around the world. Now, if you look at Seoul, metropolitan city, once again, about 200,000 people live in Junggu area. But with the 1988 Seoul Olympic, the population increased to 10 million. But now it's about 25 million residents reside in Seoul area. So it's a super mega polis. If you think about the future of the Pyongyang, it's merely the residents of the 3 million resides, but sooner or later, more than half of the population will live in Pyongyang soon. So around 6 to 7 million is likely to live. We've done all of this research together with Seoul Institute, Dr. Kwon. Probably Pyongyang will undergo urbanization much more drastic than that of Seoul. Because in case of Korea, we have not only Seoul city, but we have number 2 or number 3 city, which are Daegu or Busan. But in case of North Korea, they don't have those kind of 2 or 3 cities. In case of the level of the infrastructure, excluding Pyongyang, the places like Wonchang or other area, infrastructures are lagging behind. Therefore, the concentration of population will happen very much. And I'll be showing you the Google image as well. But 3 million residents live in Pyongyang, but in the future, it will become a megapolis soon. You have seen through the slide of the Professor An, there are public facilities and also the other facilities, and this will become more privatized. This is not my personal view, but also these are the result of the studies, and the private cars will drastically increase, and also there will be a private owned land, which means that the urbanization issues that Seoul has experienced will also happen in Pyongyang. Dr. Min has found this book, and I have used this for a long time, and I believe that Professor Min will talk about this a lot later on. This is the photo that I have taken 2 nights ago. Seoul, 25 million reside, and Pyongyang around 3 million resides. If we add Nampo, another area, it's still very small than that of the Seoul, and they don't have the accessibility by the transformation because everything's controlled by the government. Job, housing, proximity is also controlled by the Pyongyang government. And in other words, what I can say is that together with the SOC infrastructure, there is a high chance that Pyongyang might become a true sense of the mega scale. This is the night vision photo of the Pyongyang area. The issue that we are faced with in Korea, and also disconnected issues between the South and North Korea, and also Asian issues, all of these we need to overcome through the inter-Korean exchanges. And also, if we talk about the metropolitan city in Korea, we have Seoul, another area, but the gap between Seoul and Pyongyang is widening more and more, which means that there might be greater hurdles that we need to jump over. Together with the technology power that we have and the manpower of the Pyongyang, in every corner, I'm sure that Korean Peninsula will be able to strengthen the global competitiveness, especially East Asia Railway community. If we connect it through North Korea via Pyongyang, definitely this is emotionally quite touching. But if we connect it around the border, that's a different thing. But we can connect it via land all the way to London. Then we can make new inroads into the continent. And Korea has a strong competitiveness in the state-of-art technology, including semiconductor. But the awareness about the globalizations and also other area, we are very much isolated country. And in a way, we are quite closed. We do have a closed perceptions. And I believe that by constructing East Asia Railway Community, such conception might change. And some time ago, it was announced, no later, we will be having these high-speed transit stations based on the fourth generation's mobility connection. Seoul will be totally changed. So this GTX, if it's connected, everything will be changed around the transit city. New aspect will be able to show. So if Seoul and Pyongyang are connected by high-speed railway or GTX, what will happen? I mean, connection itself doesn't mean anything. If it is connected by a fast bullet train, then that would be great. But using our state-of-art technology, definitely Kaesong area will be further developed, and definitely inter-Korean exchange will open a new era. Kim Jong-un, ever since became the leader at the age of 30, he has announced the 13 special economic zone, which is very specific and very detailed plan. And these are happening between Seoul and Pyongyang. And also these are connected by railway. And when that happens, I'm sure that Seoul and Pyongyang, about 35 million, a huge scale megapolis, when it happens, it will become the center area for the history, for technology, for industry, for everything. In case of Seoul, you can see that the population is 25 million, that the per capita income is about 30,000, and we need to think about the future. When we built this new city 30 years ago, we didn't think about it. But also we didn't think about the three major megapolis. Everything was done in an ad hoc manner in order to stabilize the housing price. We built a new city, we connected it, and that's why we didn't even think about GTX. However, we know that Pyongyang can be a mega regions, and they need to build a transit center, and the new cities can be built. And by doing that, we can reduce the unification cost. Because South Korea, we do have the know-how how to resolve the urbanization issues. As you have seen, Pyongyang, how should I say, has the system that is most likely to be regarded as the socialist ideal city, a linear concept. And based on openness and reform, maybe Pyongyang mega region can represent the socialist ideal concept. But also it is regarded as the most representative city, and if a GTX is built around Pyongyang mega regions, then definitely it can contribute greatly. I believe the closest model that we can find is Paris. Mayor of the Paris are doing a great work because he is trying to build exemplary cities around it, and our mega-scale cities are built where R&D, academia, and universities, all of these are built outside these mega regions. We have a green belt area, but every year, because of the green belt, which is now being regulated, it's quite hard to control that. But if the outskirts of Pyongyang are regarded as green belt, and outside that green belt, if we build GTX connected, then definitely it will achieve a great growth. What about green belt? How can we manage that? What about the airport? What about the GTX? Because Korea has experienced trials and error, we can definitely establish a much better system. Once in every year, we establish a new national plan, and we renovate and revise that plan. But now is a time that we need to come up with more expendable and continental expansion type of the land divisions. The area of the country remains unchanged, and also it's merely 100,000 square kilometers, the border area, and we are pouring a lot of financial resources, but we need to think about more expansion type of the land, more continental type. If we do that, definitely a new world visions can be deeply rooted among the youth, and I'm sure that we can turn up with a new national visions when it's connected to the GTX, what will happen, and once again a new picture can be drawn. Well, 2032 joint hosting of the Summer Olympic is not the end of that, it's still ongoing, and the impact, we need to think about that too. Well, the academy that I work for is doing a competitions and also academy. I just want to introduce briefly. Professor An touched upon the history and architecture, and I myself have touched the future visions focusing on urban planning and prospect of change, the mobility of South Korea and new industry positions that Korea has. We can definitely open a new era for the inter-Korean exchange. Thank you very much, Kim Hyun-soo, for your presentation. Especially Seoul and Pyongyang, the future of urban planning for Pyongyang and connecting Pyongyang with Seoul, what kind of grand visions we can unfold was mentioned by Professor Kim Hyun-soo. Connecting Seoul and Pyongyang, as long as we can easily communicate, this is a future that we can definitely not only dream about but can realize that, and connecting the railway is critical. In the past, between Seoul and Busan, we have opened the train called Saemaul, and ever since that, the to and from Seoul to Busan was possible within one day. And if high-speed railway is connected between Seoul and Pyongyang, because the bullet trains, the speed is about 350 km per hour. So if we establish that high-speed bullet train between Seoul and Pyongyang, it will be connected in less than 3 hours. So within 3 hours, we can commute, which means that within 1 hour to and from travel times can be connected to all the way to the China, Mongolia, and Far Eastern area. So Northeast Asian regions can be traveled to and from in one day. Technology-wise, this is feasible. The only matter is just passing through North Korea. And as Professor Kim Hyun-soo mentioned, Seoul and Pyongyang, making it as a mega region can definitely be possible. And when that happens, Seoul and Pyongyang area can emerge as a core area for the Northeast Asian region. Thank you.
And now we have two discussants. We'd like to invite them for their comments. We are slightly behind our schedule, so I'd like to kindly ask you to keep within 7 minutes, respectively. First, I would like to invite Mr. Kwon Young-Duk, Emeritus Fellow at the Seoul Institute. He has been studying Seoul and Pyongyang at the Seoul Institute for a very long period of time. I believe he is one of the most qualified person to discuss this topic. Thank you very much. I listened to the presentations. The first presentation was on the history and architecture of Pyongyang, and the other presentation was on the present and the future of Pyongyang based on the urban planning and prospect of change. So let me briefly summarize the presentations and also share my thoughts and opinions. First, Professor Chang-mo's presentation. It had a historical perception of Pyongyang, and it shared the city's development history and spatial changes. And this will be very helpful in understanding Pyongyang today. From the ancient time, Pyongyang has a very important historical meaning, especially in North Korea. It has been the central historical city of the Korean peninsula. And from our perspective as well, it also holds an equally important meaning. And during the Korea era, it served as one of the central cities in the Korean peninsula. And you also referred to the historical papers to give the explanation. From a historical perspective, there was lots of changes in the function and structure of the city because of the from the Korean Empire, the imperial rule, as well as the liberation and the socialist urban plannings. And you went through this in a very well-organized overview, and especially during the Japanese occupation, it served as a military source for the Manchurian region to support with the military resources. And you also referred to the historical material for this explanation. And regarding this topic, I also analyzed the mappings as well. During the Korean War, there were massive air raids on Pyongyang, and it was virtually destroyed. And then this was recovered through the socialist urban recovery projects. And in the old districts, many of the streets that were developed during the colonial rule remained unchanged. And after 1945, the post-war recovery project was implemented, and up to 1990s, you went through the historical overview and pointed out the major changes in the urban region and construction of major public architectures. And this will also be very helpful and valuable for the general public in South Korea in understanding Pyongyang. And it is known that these public facilities are still being very well used. In the initial phase, Pyongyang is a kind of a planned city as a model urban center with population less than 1 million. But during the 1990s, the population almost tripled to 3 million, and with that, new city development projects were implemented. And redevelopment projects were also implemented as well. And we can see the changes in the urban space, both in terms of quantity and quality. And we have many architectural heritages of socialism left in Pyongyang. So I think it is important to hurry with its registering at the UNESCO Cultural Historical Heritage so that its artifacts and sites are well preserved. And since this is a very historical city, Pyongyang and its surrounding regions have many tombs. And also other types of valuable burial cultural assets. And since it is exposed to destruction and damage in the process of development, it is important to set some preemptive measures, such as excavating the cultural and historical assets and build basic materials and establish a preservation zone. And next on Professor Kim Hyun-soo's presentation on urban planning and the prospect of change. You discuss the social ideologies and its main principles, and also put a new perspective on the urban planning of Pyongyang. But in a strict perspective, Pyongyang is not a small city, it is a large city. And from the economic perspective and the living standards perspective, there is a disparity with other cities. Even though it did follow a socialist urban planning, there are certain uniqueness to Pyongyang. Also, it could be a linear type of city. And it could also include self-sufficient living zones in residential areas. But with the expansion of its size, it became difficult to maintain its existing structure. Originally, mass transport was the focus and was developed as a linear city. Unlike Seoul, along the main streets, the high-rise residential buildings are mainly constructed. And unlike Seoul, Pyongyang pursues convergence of the urban environment and the rural environment. So even the administrative sector is 3 times bigger, the population is much smaller than Korea, and it has been developed into a self-reliant city. There were certain controls on the population migration, so it was difficult for Pyongyang to grow into a mega city like Seoul. Nevertheless, Pyongyang is still the main center and exerts a main impact on the economic and political issues and areas of North Korea. And you also talked about the small residential areas during the early 2000s. With certain changes, with the impact of the market economy, you also mentioned that the basic center of such residential areas became weakened, and that I think we could also predict that the reform and opening is one inevitable pathway. Just to Professor Kim, there is likelihood that the market economy will have a major influence in the urban structure as well. Just like Beijing and Ho Chi Minh of China and Vietnam. You gave these references, and these seem to be very relevant and meaningful. We will see a more liberal migration of the people, and with greater personal private property ownership, we could see that the urban center will grow more fastly, and we will see a big disparity between the city and rural areas, which could also lead to many urban issues. So it is likely Pyongyang is also needed to make preparations. But just like China or Vietnam and North Korean urban experts do not have sufficient understanding of the private economy because they have long experienced a planned economy, a public economy. So these could be certain challenges. So I believe South Korea's urbanization experience could be a reference. If the market economy is applied, the urban structure could be recomposed, and there could be an introduction of private ownership and others. And these were all well noted in the presentation. And you also made certain predictions for the future direction of mega Pyongyang city. And Pyongyang and Seoul, maintaining their features of the capitals of South and North Korea, have also differences. So if they create mega centers, and when we think of we could also think of an integrated economic bloc on the Korean Peninsula as a central urban core of Northeast Asia. And I think this is a very significant implication. As a matter of fact, I personally conducted a relevant research in this area with Professor Chang-mo and Professor Hyun-soo. When we look ahead into the future of Pyongyang, there are many things to think about, so I'd like to briefly mention a couple of them. First of all, just as been mentioned, in terms of population, there was a strict control of migration. But with reform and opening and economic activities being more active, it is likely that such control will be weakened, and larger portion of the population will concentrate into Pyongyang. So I think this could be one challenge that should be considered in advance. And secondly, we could also consider a massive increase of personal vehicles, which could create a massive burden on the environment. Currently, Pyongyang makes not much consideration of parking spaces, but with the expansion of daily activities, Pyongyang should consider high-speed railway networks or other type of public transport. And In the process of transitioning into a capitalist economy, there could be changes in the land ownership. So such functionings and repositioning should be considered, including the relocations of existing manufacturing sites. So I think these are some major issues that should be considered for the future of Pyongyang as a city. With that, I'd like to conclude my discussion. Thank you very much, Professor Kwon. You commented on some very important future projections of Pyongyang.
Last discussant is Director Choi Dae-Sik from Land and Housing Institute. Recently, very actively, he's done research on the changes taking place in Pyongyang, especially urban and housing area. Hello everyone, he is virtually joining us via Zoom. Hello, can you hear me well? Yes, we can hear you. I was just introduced by the moderator. My name is Choi Dae-Sik from Land and Housing Institute. We heard presentation from two speakers. Thank you. Professor Chang-mo, who talked about the history and architecture of Pyongyang, which is the socialist country, and thank you for sharing your presentation material. I feel like I'm sitting here, but I have traveled riding a time machine to Pyongyang. The discussion that I'd like to focus on is, in a way, a little bit different from what Emeritus fellow Kwon Young-Duk mentioned. The position of North Korea right now, considering that, I'd like to make a discussion how we need to understand North Korea. First of all, Professor Chang-mo, you talked about the formation of Pyongyang's architecture and urban structure through a variety of the valuable data. And also, you mentioned that these are the representative of the socialist country. And in his presentation, yes, he talked about micro-district architecture. And since the 1970s, the transitions from these architectures to street constructions can be seen as one of the big change. In addition to his interpretations about the transitions that has been taken place, he also talked about street building project. Professor An, aside from his interpretation, I'd like to add one thing. This is very unique. North Korea's strategy of coming up with a unique urban landscape formation, not only in the city of Pyongyang, but also in other cities. The North Koreans visiting in Pyongyang area and also visitors from foreign countries will have a deep impressions about Pyongyang. And I'm sure that when they pass the streets of Pyongyang, they will be passing the large street adjacent, and also these are the area where they'll be able to see the superiority on and also the prosperity of North Korean socialism. So once again, through these building projects, once again, we can see that Pyongyang tried to show their superiorities. Another comment that I'd like to make is, recently, there were some articles about North Korean urban and architectural landscape. Of course, North Korea released those articles to publicize their status, but it was quite impressive. Let me introduce a couple of that. Based on the couple of articles that North Korea released, they talked about the formations of the urban and architectural landscape focusing on art and also how they aimed at praising and promoting their systems and also giving a glimpse into the directions of the important architecture and urban design of North Korea. And Also, the formations of urban architecture means the process of creating an ornament or shape that shows a certain ideological and artistic character of the harmonizing and combining elements that make up the city architecture. So this is like a compatibility, which means the property of the characteristic that multiple objects can exchange. And also, you talked about the urban architecture formations, but we need to think about the city level, artistic, and also the order and academic way. We need to understand that they are having a lot of discussions about that. Now, let me go into Professor Kim Hyun-soo's presentation. Professor Kim Hyun-soo talked about the Pyongyang's urban planning and the future of a Pyongyang metropolitan area, and comprehensively introduced a socialist urban planning theory and explains the context of the urban spatial structure formation. In addition, he talked about how Pyongyang and Seoul can become mega regions, and not only Seoul and Pyongyang, but also even all the way to Northeast Asian region. Professor Kim Hyun-soo, in his presentation, there must be one premises, and which I'd like to point out. The metropolitan area of Pyongyang, the growth of that, will Pyongyang grow the same way as Seoul did? Will it be similar path? And the growth process of the capitalist metropolis will be same. Of course, there will be some inter-Korean exchanges like goods and services exchanges when it's freely done. As Kim Hyun-soo mentioned, Pyongyang city's development path will be very similar to that of Seoul. I totally agree. However, we need to take a different perspective. Of course, North Korea focuses on economic growth, but there must be a premises, which is the system, North Korean system and regime guarantee. So I have a slightly different premises because we need to think about the mega region growth based on the market principle, and that isn't likely to happen in the near future. And North Korea would like to minimize any risk imposed on their regime and system. And although they are putting a lot of emphasis on the economic growth, still they'd like to protect their regimes in order for North Korea to go through the path of development. They must allow some sort of the market transactions, and they need to ease down their principle, which means that rapid opening is not likely to happen. But from the position of North Korea, in the past they had a special designs like self-sufficiency or growth control or pressures, all of these, especially growing their own countries in excessive urban growth. How can they suppress that? So how the North Korean special policy stance of the self-sufficiency and suppressions of the excessive urban growth likely to happen? There is a big possibility of selective growth while maintaining the current system. And I'll give an example. Around Pyongyang area, Eunjeong, Nampo, or other areas are designated as a special economic zone or economic development zone in a quite limited way. They are forming a center or a sort of a commercial logistic functions, and also the markets are developed around this area. So these areas are mainly developed and nurtured, and these are the strategies that they are focusing on. So still, although the country is tightly controlled, still they will deploy strategy to develop their growth. That's about my discussion. Thank you.
네, 다e-sik 박사님 말씀 감사합니다.
Thank you very much, Mr. Choi. You talked about instead of expanding into a rapid center, you talked about the bigger possibility of a phased development. We don't have enough time, but we do have audience with us who have been with us for a long time. So we will collect a couple of questions or comments from the floor, if there are any. And also, if there are questions or comments from our online participants, you may share them with us through our chat box. Are there any questions or comments?
채팅창에 혹시
At the chat box. In the chatting box, there seems to be a question. Well, the letters are too small. Well, no, yes, I've been told there aren't any questions. And then, since we don't have additional questions, we may ask our speakers to make some brief replies to the comments from our discussants. First, Professor Professor Kwon and Professor Choi gave comments on the presentations. I'd like to ask Professor An to give your comments. Thank you for your feedback. Well, I don't think there aren't any comments that could cause controversy, and so I am grateful for the presentations and the discussions. But there are certain topics that we differ in our opinion. Professor Kwon, you said that when you look at the Pyongyang's mapping, you said that there are the ancient remainings left in a majority, but I think it depends on how you define the overall boundary of the old districts. But when you focus on within the interior of the Pyongyang castle, there in between the middle castle and the inner castle, the railway went through, and in the eastern part, there was a flat land and the grid structure was established. So we can virtually say that the old remainings don't hardly exist. But when you look at the rear part of the railway, and when you look at the older maps of Pyongyang, you will be able to see that there is the Goguryeo type of grid structure called 방이제. And during the colonial occupation, a majority of that structure remained unchanged. It's still in the grid type. And I think that could be relevant to what you mentioned. But for the remaining, actually, there aren't many remains of the ancient old times. When you look at the Eastern Pyongyang times, there are certain remainings of the colonial rule, but in the Eastern Pyongyang part, a wetland is very broad. And the waterway is something that you cannot change easily. So the path of the water and the surrounding environment, and considering there was a coal mine, these structures may remain. And for Professor Choi's comments of the 1970s landscape geographical recovery, and I think there were many monumental construction projects. But this wasn't limited to Pyongyang, though there were differences in degree, but I think it is quite common in all countries, especially very strong in socialist countries. They promote and pursue a planned economy, a planned construction. And when you compare the landscape of a historical city and a newly planned city, there's a big difference. Moscow has a long history, and on top of the historical city, it tried to add planned elements. The Red Square of Kremlin could be an example as a socialist element. But that is not the symbol of socialism. Rather, the so-called Seven Sisters of the Lenin is one of the most typical examples. 7 sites still remain, and this is also presented to the sister and friendship countries such as China and Poland. So, such monumental development of a new planned city and these landscapes of a historical city has to do with the composition or the formation of a city. And I think I could end at this point, just to add one more thing, which I couldn't cover because of time constraints. In 2013, in Berlin, I did a comparison of the city structure of Seoul and Pyongyang and how ideology influenced the two cities in different ways. And I actually oversaw an exhibition. What I thought back then was, when you think of Seoul, it has a structure of a historical city, but was developed as a capital city, and it has its value as a cultural heritage. And Pyongyang, even though it has its overall backbone of a historical city, but since it had nothing to begin with, it could be a center. It could be a site where the city, a planned city, faithful to socialist planning, has been well preserved during the 1960s. And this also is worthy of being registered as a cultural heritage. And we could think of Brasilia. And it could be cited as a most symbolic site that preserves the strongest ideological upheaval during the 20th century. And I think that is where the value of Pyongyang is. Seoul has its historical value, and it has its worth as a cultural heritage. And Pyongyang is a modernist city that encompasses the 20th century ideological upheaval. And it has its value as a heritage. And if these two are registered, I think this would be very meaningful. Thank you very much.
김현수 교수님.
Professor Kim Hyun-soo, briefly. Thank you. What kind of path will North Korea take to achieve openness and reform? Of course, the result will be very different depending on what road it will take. I'm not here to give you the answer, but if you look at Russia or Germany, a sudden collapse and then a sudden change will not happen, or will, just like China, slowly, step by step, will there be a changes? I think it will be similar to that of the later one, which is the China. And I just wanted to draw the picture of Pyongyang because we have undergone trials and errors, so we can give advices and we can think about what might happen. And Hawaii, Beijing, Shanghai, we know what have happened. No matter what path does North Korea take, we know that the housing market, the land market, everything will change. And the experts in this urban area and architecture area, if personal exchanges is possible, would like to give advices to North Korea, and definitely they can be very helpful to North Korea. Of course, this is my hope. As Director Choi mentioned, I don't think that is likely to happen in the near future, especially because the United States has its own stand. So mainly North Korea will implement openness based on this special economic zone growth. But this will be very different than that of the Kaesong Industrial Complex, because 2 years ago, during the UN General Assembly, he presented the idea, or he made a proposal to North Korea about building an international zone in the Pyongyang area. This is not only a political agenda, but 4 or 5 years from now, the GTX will be connected all the way to Paju, and connecting this GTX all the way to Pyongyang is not that difficult. Through innovative personnel, we can advance GTX and then definitely achieve greater growth in Pyongyang area. Well, the explosions of the Inter-Korean Liaison Office, I don't know the main reason for that, but had we had that continuously, probably we could work more. In case of Pangyo is a small area, and as you know that a huge amount of the sales revenue are occurring in Pangyo area, and definitely we can create a similar system.
네, 김현수 교수님.
Thank you, Professor Kim Hyun-soo. Well, we heard the presentation by two speakers and also two discussants, full of insight. It was a great session. Korean Peninsula, if we undergo a great transformation era, then what kind of changes will occur in Pyongyang? Some time ago, U.S. and ROK had a summit, and they talk about the engagement, cooperations, and inter-Korean exchanges, which was supported by the United States. Let me express my hope. The Institute for Far Eastern Study, the international conference we have today, I hope to have the international conference next year in Pyongyang. And not political, but talking about urban planning or the future of the Korean Peninsula, talking about the designing and planning the city spatial. And if we can have a conference between the two capital cities, that would be great. And not only just exchanging the expertise, but also we can exchange our experience, the merits and advantage of the Pyongyang city can be shared to us, vice versa, and that will be a great opportunity. So I hope that non-political, a pure sense of the academic exchanges and also working together for the better urban planning can start from right here. And slowly we can expand that. That was just a dream that I wanted to share. That concludes the first session. Thank you once again for the participants joining us on site and virtually. The second session will start from 3 o'clock. So we'll take a break and we'll start at 3 o'clock. Thank you. Thank you for your attention.